Welcome to World Affairs Today, brought to you by the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C., a leading forum for global education and international affairs.
My name is Stephanie Fassler, and I am the International Affairs Program Director for the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. On behalf of the Council, I welcome you to this Foreign Policy Panel and World Affairs Today program. Sanctions as a foreign policy tool, helpful or harmful? Sanctions are often employed by governments and institutions as a means of altering the behavior of other governments and states, whether those behaviors happen domestically or internationally. Often seen as a non-military means of intervening in a country, sanctions are credited with bringing an end to the apartheid regime in South Africa and bringing Iran to the negotiating table for a nuclear deal. However, sanctions proved ineffective in removing the Castros from power in Cuba. Some argue that sanctions actually hurt the enforcing country's economy by denying their companies business opportunities. It has been also argued that sanctions cause more harm to the citizenry of the state, as in the case of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. Are sanctions an effective tool of foreign policy, or do they cause more harm than good? Tonight, our panelists will seek to answer this question. Arguing that sanctions are an effective foreign policy tool is Mr. David Kramer. Mr. Kramer is the Senior Director for Human Rights and Human Freedom at the McCain Institute for International Leadership. Prior to this position, he served for 4 years as President of Freedom House. Before his tenure there, he was a Senior Transatlantic Fellow at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. He also served for 8 years in the U.S. Department of State. Arguing that sanctions are more harmful than helpful will be Bill Reinsch, President of the National Foreign Trade Council. Prior to joining NFTC, Mr. Reinsch served as the Undersecretary for Export Administration in the U.S. Department of Commerce. Mr. Reinsch previously spent 20 years on Capitol Hill as Senior Legislative Assistant to the late Senator John Hines, as well as Senator John D. Rockefeller IV. Moderating tonight's panel is Mr. Tony Colley-Foster, President and CEO of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Previously, Mr. Colley-Foster established CFCO International, a business consultancy specializing in business management, government relations, and support services to the senior management who seek to enter the American market. Prior to this, he was the director of the Boys and Girls Club of Chicago, as well as the founding chairman of the Northern Ireland Partnership, USA, and the Northern Ireland United States Chamber of Commerce Incorporated. Please join me in welcoming this evening's panelists.
Well, it's a great privilege for me to be here tonight. Honored to welcome David Kramer and Bill Reinsch to our World Affairs Council DC forum tonight. Each of these men has significant, not only domestic, but global experience on this issue of sanctions. That very provocative title that Stephanie created for this panel tonight, Sanctions as a Foreign Policy Tool, helpful or harmful, left out a short phrase, to whom?
Exactly.
As you know, you can back in history and look at the Greek history of when 3 women were abducted, taken off, and sanctions were imposed until they were returned, which led to the Peloponnesian Wars. Now, probably the most recent successful sanctions regime that was imposed and created, I think, global attention on the use of sanctions as a foreign policy in the 20th century was the sanctions that were imposed on South Africa through the Sullivan Principles and other policy initiatives to help bring about the collapse of apartheid and to ensure a transition to a better life for many in South Africa. I'm going to begin tonight by asking David Kramer what he feels are some examples, and if you could stop at 3, David, if you've got them, of successful use of sanctions as a foreign policy tool. I won't ask you to do that. I will ask you to say why you believe that sanctions should not be deployed as frequently as they have as a foreign policy tool. Okay.
Great. Tony, thanks very much, and it's a pleasure to be on the panel with Bill and Stephanie. To you and your colleagues, thanks for all the work and inviting me to join you here this evening. I am going to answer the question, helpful or harmful. I certainly look at it from U.S. national interest as both. I think it's not a black and white issue, and so I hate to disappoint those who are expecting a knockdown, drag-out fight between Bill and me. It's probably not going to happen so much. But I do believe that sanctions are an important tool for us to have at our disposal. When we talk about sanctions, the very fact that we're talking about the possibility of them reflects a failure of other tools that we have available to us that haven't worked, that haven't brought about the kind of change or behavior or policy in another country. And so when we talk about sanctions, it is a reflection that everything else we've tried up to that point has not worked. I don't advocate sanctions with pleasure or joy. I do it, though, because I think in some cases it is an effective tool for us to use in confronting dangers and threats and challenges and gross human rights abuses. I would certainly include in that category. I think there's no denying that they can harm companies and hurt U.S. businesses. I think it would be silly of me to sit here and say tough, or to just fluff that off. I certainly understand and recognize the importance of the corporate community in the United States and the critical role it plays in driving our economy.
You're making my job harder.
Excellent, good. But that said, there are some inherent risks that come when companies do business in environments that aren't the most conducive for U.S. national interests. And so I think companies also have to recognize that they can't always have the good without the bad. The Peterson Institute did a study back in 2007 that suggested sanctions were effective in about 1/3 of the times that they've been applied. Tony, you asked, you said you wouldn't ask, but some cases where I think they've been successful. South Africa, Stephanie mentioned. I would say in the case of Iran, they certainly have produced an Iranian regime that is more inclined to negotiate, putting aside any judgment about what kind of deal, if there is going to be one, that will come about next month. Communist government in Poland in the 1980s, I would cite as another example. And then a case that I was involved in the State Department when I was there in 2006 to 2008 was Belarus. Now you may wonder why Belarus. Belarus because the sanctions that the US and EU imposed together, although the US went further in 2007, were specifically designed to win the release of political prisoners. And in fact, they did win the release of the political prisoners. They were not imposed to try to create a democracy in Belarus. Sanctions aren't a tool to do that. But they can try to get governments to undo bad behavior. And I would argue, based on publicly available information and information we had available at the time when I was in the government, that the additional sanctions in particular that the US imposed in November 2007 triggered the start of the release of political prisoners in January 2008. A colleague of mine, Damon Wilson, and I wrote a piece in the American Interest a few years ago on this very subject. They failed, I think, no question, in Cuba. And again, I don't want to get into it, we can in Q&A if you want, about whether the change in policy by the president was the right one. That's a different issue. But I think most people would argue that the sanctions imposed against the Castro regime for the past 5+ decades have not brought about really any kind of change that we were trying to bring about there. I would say in Zimbabwe, and here I appreciate the work Stacey did for me on this, where we imposed sanctions in 2002. Mugabe is still there, still very much in control. despite efforts to bring about a transitional government, hasn't worked. So, and there are many other examples. Stacy found a list from the Treasury Department's website of some 26 different kinds of sanctions we have in place against both governments and regimes, as well as against specific kinds of activity that include counterterrorism, organized crime, trafficking in persons, which actually I don't think is on this list. So we have sanctions against a whole slew of different kinds of actors and targets. What does it mean when they work? What does it mean when they're helpful? I think what I at least mean is they change the behavior of a government that we're targeting. They secure the release of political prisoners. They deter further bad behavior. And I would argue for a while that was the case with Russia and Ukraine, where the imposition of sanctions, I wish they had been tougher. I wish they had been more preemptive rather than so reactive and slow. Nevertheless, I think the sanctions that the US and EU imposed on Russia last year did prevent Putin from moving further at that time into Ukraine. I would argue we have undermined the effectiveness of the sanctions when we keep talking about easing sanctions if Putin complies with the request that we have made, which is essentially to get out of Ukraine and respect Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity. When US officials, European officials, talk about, well, maybe we can ease the sanctions after the latest Minsk agreement was signed, we undermine the effectiveness of the sanctions. The target of the sanctions, I would argue, has to think that he or she is going to get hit with more sanctions if he or she does not change his or her behavior. Sanctions are as much punitive, but they're also psychological. The target has to think that if the behavior doesn't change, they're going to get hit with more. We undermine their effectiveness every time we talk about easing sanctions when the target of the sanctions has not changed behavior. The sanctions aren't meant to produce an economic collapse or an economic meltdown. That may happen. You look at the case of Russia. Russia's experiencing an enormous economic crisis. The price of oil has as much to do with that, probably arguably more than sanctions have. Putin, in a press conference in December last year, attributed Russia's economic difficulties as being responsible for 25 to 30% of Russia's problems. I have no idea how he quantified that. But the very acknowledgement by Putin that sanctions were having an effect, I would argue, is a plus for those who have advocated for sanctions. The problem has been it has not changed his calculus when it comes to his policy and behavior toward Ukraine. And that leads me to a point, which is sanctions can't be the only tool we use. They can't be done in a vacuum. It is important to try to do them with others, particularly the Europeans. Canadians have been terrific on sanctions, on Russia for Ukraine, Australians and others, Japanese. But they can't be the only means that we use to try to change behavior. It's one of the reasons, again, I don't want to digress us into military assistance for Ukraine. I'm a firm believer in providing that, but I think that has to accompany the sanctions we've imposed against the Putin regime for what it's done in Ukraine. Sanctions on their own, I would argue, aren't going to do it. It also requires a sustained level of engagement. It is not good enough to simply impose sanctions on a regime, check that box, and move on. You have to maintain the diplomatic pressure and presence, and sometimes at the highest levels, including the presidential level, in order to ensure that they are more effective. You need to have a roadmap so that the target of the sanctions sees a way out. If they change their behavior, if they release political prisoners, if they respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of their neighbors, there is a way out for ending the sanctions. Lastly, because I think I'm running out of time, let me come to Russia. It's an issue that I've been actively involved in. I'm now have been out of government for actually 6 years, thereabouts. Yes, 6 years. But I've been pushing this from the outside. I was a strong proponent of the Magnitsky legislation, which imposes a visa ban and asset freeze on Russian officials involved in gross human rights abuses. I wish the Europeans would have passed Magnitsky legislation because I think it would have much greater impact if it wasn't just a U.S. action. It's to my chagrin that the Europeans have not taken this step. But still, I do think there is a role for U.S. leadership, and I thought that was the case with the Magnitsky Act. Then there's the separate sanctions that have been imposed for what Russia's been doing to Ukraine, for violating its sovereignty and territorial integrity, for invading the country. And here we have maintained pretty good unity with the EU and with other countries. And I would argue that they have been effective, in part because of all the countries and others listed here, Russia is by far the most integrated into the global economy of any other target of sanctions. And when a country is so integrated, it is bound to be more affected when you cut off refinancing opportunities, when you talk about, we haven't done it yet, kicking Russia out of SWIFT. I strongly advocate that, recognizing that would have a big impact. And so we have more means available to have an impact on the Russian economy than if Russia were a North Korea economy, or frankly, even a Belarusian economy. So there are pluses and minuses, though, and here I'll end. The flip side of the Russia's integration with the global economy means that a lot of companies and even countries in the West are going to be hurt. But let's also remember that in addition to the sanctions we have imposed on Russia, Putin has imposed sanctions on the West, but also on his own people. His response to the 2012 Magnitsky legislation, if you recall, was to ban the adoption by Americans of Russian orphans. A pretty inhumane act, if you ask me. His response to the sanctions the US and EU imposed as a result of what he did in Ukraine was to ban the imports of Western agricultural products and even medical products into Russia. Certainly has hurt companies in the West, but I would argue it's also hurting his own people. We try to change the behavior of these bad regimes through sanctions. He hurts his own people while also causing some difficulties for us, there's no question. So I do believe sanctions are an important tool for us to use. I certainly don't think they're the only tool available, but I also recognize there are downsides to them as well.
Well, David, for a man of few words, that was quite an opening statement.
I'm from Boston.
All right, he's from Boston. Bill, I'd like to come over to you. And you can have equal time if you so desire, but
Oh, at least.
you may get yanked, all right?
It's always easier to argue with someone who's unreasonable, and David has not been, so it's going to be a little difficult. But I'm going to speak from the business perspective, as you might imagine, and make about 5 points. But before I get there, let me just say that this is a complicated issue, and it spins out in different ways depending upon how you want to divide these things up. I'm going to be talking mostly about unilateral sanctions, which in my view almost never work.
Yep.
The examples of success, and I would dispute some of the examples of success. So would the South Africans, incidentally, who will tell you that sanctions didn't have anything to do with what happened in South Africa. You can believe that or not, but that's what they think. The successful cases, or the arguably successful cases, are almost always multilateral. It also depends a lot on what your goal is, which is something that David talked about. I think what the Peterson Institute concluded, which was a voluminous survey, they looked at every one since 1918 or something like that, is the smaller the country, the smaller the target country, the more likely they are to work, and the more modest the goal, the more likely they are to work. So if your goal is regime change, you've got a pretty high hill to climb, because you're asking, the perpetrator of whatever the bad things you're against to take himself out of the picture. If your goal is to get some prisoners released, that's a much more realistic goal, and you're more likely to have success. So you have to measure these things by what they're designed to accomplish, by whether they're multilateral or unilateral. In our experience, you also have to measure them by who imposes them. In the American context, that means, did they come from Congress or did they come from the executive branch? If they come from Congress, they are almost always arbitrary, inflexible, and counterproductive, and difficult to unwind. The classic example was the Congress imposed import sanctions against Uganda when Idi Amin was there. Amin left. Had these been executive branch sanctions, they could have been removed. There was sanctions around coffee imports, which was an important part of the Ugandan economy. It took Congress 2 years to repeal the legislation it had enacted. 2 years when we could have been helping the Ugandan economy grow, because they're legislative. This is a problem we're going to have with Iran. because Congress has done the same thing. So in that context, from a business perspective, sanctions are, unilateral sanctions in particular, in our judgment, are almost always lose-lose. They're a loss for the U.S. government because it is very difficult for the government to achieve its objectives if other countries are not following along. They will come in and backfill whatever economic activity you've stopped. And they're lose for American business because they lose the activity that they were engaged in. And you know, we've had countless examples of that. I'll probably tell you a story or two along the way. What are some of those costs? And these are things that don't get talked about very often. We go up to the Hill and say, you know, you ought to do a cost-benefit analysis. And the response we get from the Hill is it's always the same. It says, we know it won't work, but we have to do something. You know, and for them, I think the administration, any administration, not any particular one, addresses these things with a little bit more care. From the Hill's perspective, we have to make a statement. We cannot be seen as being silent when this egregious violation of human rights or whatever it is has occurred. We have to do something. It doesn't matter if it works. We also go back and explain some of the things I'm going to tell you, and they always say, well, that's not what we meant. You know, we didn't intend for that to happen. And we said, well, okay, but that's what happened. And so in business, my guys are the ones that get left holding the bag with collateral damage and unintended consequences. So the costs for us are pretty clear. There's the obvious, immediate, direct cost. If companies are forced out of doing business in a country, they lose that business. There is the associated incremental cost as sanctions begin at one level and then are ratcheted up when they fail to succeed at the initial level. The company's business there is gradually tightened and restricted, and they lose more than they lost the first time. The smart companies see the handwriting on the wall and tend to get out, but there is this, you know, incremental effect. And some companies are there, you know, if you've made a large capital investment there, you've built a $3 billion fab plant, or if you're drilling for oil there, it's a little bit different than if you're selling soap. It's a lot harder to get out, and the losses are a lot bigger. There are also indirect costs in the sense of compliance costs. There are legal fees and other costs to actually review, interpret, and give advice on how to follow the regulations, because these things are always parsed very, very finely, and it takes a lot of legal work. Every law firm in town is doing seminars right now on well, this week it's Cuba, but you know, last year it was Iran. For large companies, these actually are millions of dollars per company in legal costs. There's also the reputational damage for those who are accused of not complying, which is significant, and these are variable. Companies that make branded retail products, and I won't mention any particular ones, but you can imagine, can be subject to consumer boycotts, while companies that make intermediate products, the people that make the wires and the cables that go into machinery, never get hit. But if you make a consumer product, if you're Coca-Cola, well, I will mention a few. If you're Coca-Cola, if you're KFC, you have two kinds of problems. First of all, you've got the people that are mad at you in the target country who smash your windows and destroy your shops, and then you have the people in this country that are mad at you because you're not pulling out of there fast enough, who boycott you here. So they're struck, you know, they get it at both ends. Currently, the biggest problem is what we refer to as collateral damage. U.S. law and policy permit humanitarian trade for every sanction that we have in place. Humanitarian trade means food and medical stuff. And these are all, it's not free. You have to get a license from the Treasury Department, from the Office of Foreign Assets Control. So you've got this piece of paper that says it's okay to ship wheat to Iran, and it is. Yet what we've discovered, particularly through the advent of financial sanctions, which are the new kid on the block as these things go, that these companies can't get financing for their exports because banks have decided that it's easier to avoid all transactions with a target country rather than try to parse which transactions are good, which transactions are bad. Because if they try to parse which ones are good and which ones are bad, then they risk running into a foul of the law and having their own compliance problem. So they just, and it's not that much money, so they just say, we're not going to do any of them. This was, you know, this was dismissed by the administration when we brought this to their attention as well, collateral damage. Then the New York Times did a story in the fall of 2013, I think it was, about Iranian women with cancer who were dying because they couldn't get their meds. And that got the administration's attention, and they revisited the regulations and did some things that they thought would make the situation a little bit easier. It didn't, but that's what they tried for. The fact that these sanctions are extraterritorial imposes additional cost if the other country, not the target country, but because our sanctions tend to reach not just American companies, but British, French, Canadian companies operating in wherever. If those countries enact a blocking statute, what happens is the company finds itself in the position of no matter what it does, it violates somebody's law. It's either if it does something, it violates American law. If it does nothing, it's violating French law. We've had companies, I'll tell you a story if you want later, that have been exactly in this situation. Companies don't like to be in a position where no matter what they do, they're breaking the law. It makes them very unhappy. The new problem we've dealt with, and this is the last issue, is, which I think are in a way the most pernicious for legal foreign policy and practical reasons, are state and local government sanctions. 28 states have enacted legislation that imposes sanctions of some kind. Usually they're in the category of a ban on doing business with a company that's doing things that are deemed to be bad, namely doing business with a bad country. Or they mandate pension fund divestment from companies that are, public pension fund divestment from companies that are engaged in this activity. Our problem with this is, first of all, courts have found these laws to be unconstitutional. Which the irony is the states don't care about that. They keep passing them anyway. But in Crosby v. NFTC, and there we are again, the National Foreign Trade Council, this was our case, which involved Burma sanctions imposed by Massachusetts, the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the sanctions were unconstitutional because they were preempted by congressional executive branch action. The decision was narrow but very, very clear. The decision essentially said if the feds have acted, the states are preempted. End of story. The feds have acted on Burma, they've acted on Iran, they've acted on Sudan, they've acted on Cuba. The states should be prevented, they've acted on Russia. They should be preempted in all these cases. It doesn't make any difference to the states. They keep passing these things, and we keep writing them letters. And we sued Illinois over a pension fund divestment issue, Giannoulias v. NFTC, and we won that one too. Unfortunately, these cost my organization a lot of money. We're trying to decide right now if we should sue Maryland or New Jersey, and I can't make up my mind. But there are also practical issues here. When sanctions move into new areas, such as requiring state pension funds to divest from companies that are doing business in problem countries, they create a new category of victims beside the countries. That category is retirees. In Illinois, and I won't go through it chapter by verse, in Illinois we determined that with respect to the pension funds that would be affected, which were mostly teachers in the state of Illinois because they were all public pension funds, the enactment of the legislation in question would have cut the average, well not the average, cut the retiree's pension annual rate of return in half. And I could explain how that works if you're interested. But if you're a retiree, that matters. They also create enormous compliance costs because what you're telling companies is you not only have to comply with federal law, you have to comply with 50 state laws, all of which are going to be different, potentially 50. Right now it's 28, but you know, who's counting? Many of which are different, many of which use a different method to determine which companies are, I mean, they all work the same way. There's a list of bad companies for divestment purposes. But those lists vary between 20 and 600 for the same country. And what companies run into then is they discover that as far as pension fund divestment is concerned, they can be in compliance with California law, but in violation of New Jersey law. So then what happens is they divest certain funds in New Jersey in order to comply with New Jersey law. Then they get sued in California for breach of their fiduciary duty, because in California what they've done is in breach of their fiduciary duty because they're not violating California law. This makes companies very unhappy too. So all of these things never get considered by Congress or even the executive branch, I would argue, when these things get taken out. These are all taken on. These things are all happen after the fact. People like me have to march in and say, well, you've created this mess. And they say, well, that's not what we meant. You know, and then you have to kind of unravel it, which causes problems. And you've got plenty of problems in addition. I won't talk about well, I'll say one word about smart sanctions, which are the sanctions du jour, which are the financial ones, which we were originally, well, I wouldn't say enthusiastic, we were originally tolerant of because they target individuals and not blanket whole countries, so we figured this is an improvement. The problem there, of course, is that you need a lot of good intelligence and plenty of information to make sure you focused on the right people. You also have the problem, Russia's a little bit easier, because they haven't figured out this particular issue yet, but in the Arab world, you've got a problem of name changes and identical names. You know, you've got thousands and thousands of people named Mohammed. One of my bank members was ordered by the government not to comply with a request to transfer funds on behalf of Charles Taylor, who was at that time the Liberian dictator who had fallen afoul of one sanction or another. Well, it turns out there are 12,000 Charles Taylors in their credit card universe. So they were trying to figure out which Charles Taylor was the one that was going to have his funds interdicted. And it was a European transaction, so they asked the European bank which Charles, you know, for a birth date, so they could try to narrow it down that way. And the European bank responded, it was under European law, we can't give you that information. That's personal information which is protected by EU privacy policy and EU privacy regulations. So you've got 12,000 Charles Taylors that have a problem. I've gone into some detail here because this is what happens when you go down this road. Now, I understand that this is a tool, and it's a tool that is employed because, you know, frankly, diplomacy has failed, and people don't want to send in troops in every one of these cases, which is the other alternative. So you look for a middle ground. This is what you come up with. It's not a very satisfactory middle ground. It causes a lot of difficulties for the people that get sucked into this, which are the people that are trying to do business there and trying to comply with a law that is, and the ensuing regulations that are always complicated and always confusing and vary from country to country and now from state to state. So I'll stop there.
If you were to hold up an example of a successful foreign policy application of sanctions that, in your opinion, did work, what would that example be?
Of U.S. sanctions,
Yes, U.S. sanctions.
not multilateral.
Your choice. I'll tell you what, make it a two-part question. Give us one on the U.S. and give us another on multilateral.
Well, again, to use the example that I had experience with, I think Belarus and political prisoners 2006 to 2008 was a success. There was a specific goal we had in mind. There were targeted sanctions, although there were wider sanctions that also got imposed that affected companies. And so I would cite that as a U.S. sanction. That was also done with the EU in 2006, but the EU did not have an appetite to increase sanctions in 2007. We went ahead in November 2007, the U.S. did, and 2 months later the political prisoners started being released. On the multilateral side, I would say Iran has had success. I think the pressure from sanctions has brought the Iranians to the table. Again, not getting into the negotiations and the deal that may or may not be struck. But I think particularly the SWIFT sanctions that were imposed had a major impact on the Iranian economy. The oil price has had an impact on Iran. It's had an impact on Russia. It has heightened the effect of sanctions, I would argue. So those are two. South Africa, I think we may agree to disagree on that. I certainly know that there are those who argue it was not sanctions. It takes away from the South Africans who push for change in their own country. But I do think it was important both in economic, financial terms, but psychologically as well. So I actually do think that they matter.
David, let's keep it on South Africa for a moment. Why do you feel, Bill, sorry, in terms of that it was not because of sanctions playing a significant role?
Well, I'd say, I mean, I don't know. What I was saying was what people said, which is the same thing as what David said. I think that a lot of the people there in the ANC would argue that it was their work that achieved the result. You know, the truth of these things is probably somewhere in the middle. I would make a point that goes back to something that Stephanie said in the beginning about South Africa, and that is about the Sullivan principles. from our point of view, Sullivan principles were not sanctions. In fact, they were the opposite of sanctions. The Sullivan principles was essentially an accountability and reporting scheme by which companies that were doing business there, this was before the sanctions, were doing business there, signed up for the principles, and that obligated them to keep track of making sure that they were non-discriminatory employment, that they were doing equal pay, that they were doing a variety of things that adhered to the principles, and they were audited periodically by Reverend Sullivan's team. And it was a way to actually, it was the opposite of sanctions in the sense that it was a way to encourage engagement. It was a way to encourage Western companies to do the right thing by staying in the country, not pulling out, continuing to do business in the country, but to do it in the right way, and to do it in the way that furthered human rights principles and, in fact, combated the apartheid government at the time. So, and that, from our standpoint, is the organization that we run that deals with this is called USA Engage. And it's called USA Engage because we believe that that kind of engagement works better than sanctions. Now, in the end, the Congress decided, and after the president vetoed it the first time, they ultimately worked out a sanctions regime that made that, that forced the American companies out. But I think the truth is the cause is somewhere in the middle. I mean, I think the cynics will tell you that the single thing that had the biggest impact in South Africa is when they got kicked out of the World Cup. Because that, which is, you can chuckle about that, but it was a big blow.
Yes.
It was.
Yes.
There's no question.
And just to follow up on that, Bill, in terms, you've said all of the reasons why you feel that sanctions are not in the best interests of the United States or, in a multilateral sense, those that get involved in this, because of as Paul Simon says, things can start out quite simply as complex things can do. And your focus on the fact that something may be adopted at the national level, and because of state rights and that, all of a sudden you've got a huge complex jigsaw puzzle here with 50 states deciding to proceed on sanctions arbitrarily. But can you share with us, please, any example that you can point to of sanctions being an effective tool in foreign policy?
I would say they're all debatable. Actually, ironically, the one that I would say was arguably the most effective, although it has not had a happy ending, is Libya. Because I think you can make a case, you can also say, and look where that got them. But you can make a case that the sanctions persuaded Gaddafi that it was the right thing for him to do was to change his non-proliferation policy, basically, and to give up his efforts to develop weapons of mass destruction. And I have mixed feelings about that one because there were other factors. And that's one of the problems. I mean, that's the problem of Iran. David can make that case that it was the sanctions that pushed them into agreement. You can also argue that it was the price of oil. You can also argue that there were a variety of internal pressures. Usually, the result in these things is a multiplicity of factors. Belarus I don't know about, so I can't attribute that. I would argue in the Russian case, while the Russians, as you noted, have certainly acknowledged that this has had an impact, there it depends a little bit on what your goal is. I would argue that it hasn't fundamentally changed Russian policy. The best you could come up with was that it produced a pause. Right now, I don't see a pause.
I agree.
And it may well be that, in a sense, it illustrates the problem of multilateralism. I talked a lot about the problem of unilateralism. The problem of multilateralism is you've got to hold everybody together. Exactly. And you've got to make sure all your troops are on the same page. And it hasn't been us that's been talking about getting rid of them. It's been the Europeans that talk about getting rid of them. And the Europeans themselves are divided. And that makes it very difficult to a united front is the thing that is most likely to achieve success. And to the extent you don't have that, then you give hope, you give aid and comfort to the target country and encourage them, if we just hang on a little longer, somebody's going to fold. So I wouldn't say that it's been a success, but it's very hard to have a success in the context that we're operating right now.
Please, David.
Can I agree completely with what Bill just said, which probably disappoints those who are expecting, again, a knockdown, drag-out fight here.
That's coming.
That's coming, excellent. It is very difficult for the EU to maintain unity at 28. And this is why I argue U.S. leadership on this issue is important, in part because I think we have to, and not let unity with the EU become our objective. I'm all for it. I mean, who's opposed to U.S.-EU unity? No one. But there are times where I do think the U.S. just has to step up and lead. You mentioned, Bill, earlier about the extraterritorial nature of sanctions, which, even if applied unilaterally, does have a much wider impact than, say, if no disrespect to Canada, if just Canada passed sanctions. But the extraterritorial nature of U.S. sanctions has a larger impact, and that's also why I would argue for us to act. On Libya, I think you're absolutely right. But I would argue Libya is an example back in 2003-04 where it wasn't just sanctions. Like or dislike the war in Iraq, what the invasion of Iraq in 2003 also had a big impact on Gaddafi's thinking. That's an example where it can't just be sanctions. It has to be other means at our disposal, preferably not military.
Well, I agree that if we invade somebody, that probably has
It will get
an
people's
impact.
attention.
Yes.
There's no question about it. But Gaddafi was obviously scared. I would argue, actually, that had more to do with Gaddafi's change.
Isn't that supposed to
in
be my
approach.
position?
It is, but this is why I say I'm disappointing everyone here. Actually, just one other point. I actually am sympathetic on your point about state and local sanctions.
Yeah.
I respect local authorities to do what they deem is important and necessary and their right to do. But I think it is a reminder that, for the most part, foreign policy should belong to the federal government. It gets complicated when we delegate it to whether it's 50 states
Yep.
or many cities and municipalities.
Well, the Constitution is conveniently very clear about
Yep,
that.
that's right.
And there are policy implications. I mean, the example I got that occurred to me, supposing fighting breaks out in Kashmir, not an entirely unlikely possibility. The state of California, with a decent-sized Indian population, decides that it's all Pakistan's fault and imposes sanctions on Pakistan. The state of Michigan, which has a decent-sized Muslim population, decides that it's all India's fault and imposes sanctions on India. Where is the United States?
Yep.
And how can we function in that kind of environment? That's what this is about. That's why the court's decision, I think, was unanimous. That when it comes to stuff like this, the country has to speak with one voice.
So how can that be resolved?
Well, I guess I got to keep on suing people.
Don't look at me like that. You're not going to sue me. All right?
Every time we
the
sue,
lawyer's ears.
every time we sue, we win. But it's frustrating because it takes.
Enormous.
It takes a lot of time and a lot of energy, and every time a state processes one of these bills, we get in touch with them and say, you're doing. We cite the court case and says you're acting in a way that's unconstitutional. Sometimes it's had a result. Sometimes it hasn't. I don't know what else we can do. We've encouraged the administration from time to time, because they're the ones that actually end up holding the bag. If a state does something that's in conflict with the president's foreign policy, that's the problem for the president. It's not just a problem for American companies. It's probably a bigger problem for him than it is for us. But administrations are kind of reluctant to take the states on this. It's just not, it doesn't make the list of the top 25 things they want to worry about.
I think at the risk of overgeneralizing, there's a slight challenge in this, which is administrations, Republican and Democrat, we both have worked in the government, tend not to like sanctions. They would rather deal with countries, manage relations, rather than impose sanctions. The Congress, being a little closer to their constituents, then step in a number of cases and say the administration's not doing enough, we have to do something, let's impose sanctions. And then you get the local communities and governments who are even closer to their constituents. If they see a vacuum left by the administration or even the Congress, then they too might step in and try to fill that void.
One of the problems you get too is, states don't have state departments.
Yeah.
I mean, they don't have a foreign policy office, and the state legislators are not, for the most part, foreign policy experts, but they're highly sensitive to their constituents. The LA area, the greater LA area has, I think, 300,000 Armenians, or Armenian Americans, and they are always getting their legislatures to introduce sanctions on Turkey in the California Assembly. Thus far, these haven't passed, but they get up there, and this is about the events of 1918, and I mean this is something that is nearly 100 years old, and American foreign policy is not to sanction Turkey because of the Armenian genocide, but it might be California's policy. We had an incident in Ohio where they were debating a pension bill that was aimed at Sudan, and the relevant committee came within one vote of adding China to the sanctions list. That would have been earth-shaking because, frankly, people don't care all that much about Sudan. It's sort of like North Korea. There's not that big an economic stake there. So, you can argue about sanctions on principle, but the reality is there were not very many American companies that were going to be hurt in the way I've described because of Sudan sanctions. You throw in China, and then you're talking about billions and billions of dollars and thousands of workers. That was one vote. I mean, it didn't pass, but it's hard because the Ohio legislature doesn't know a lot about China or a lot about foreign policy. It's not their job, but they are pushed by constituents to get into these things, and then the next thing you know, you have a bill.
Just one other thing, if I could add, Tony, is one thing I don't think we've mentioned is corruption. And those engaged in serious corrupt activities also can become targets of sanctions. There was this series in the New York Times about people buying properties in Manhattan. And what this gets at is sanctions then become a way to try to force us to look at ourselves in the mirror and correct our own way of doing business. We have to do a better job of maintaining the integrity of our systems, our financial systems, banking, others, and sometimes sanctions then become the way to force us to do that. That's not the best way. We should just automatically look at problems of corruption and deal with it on its own without having legislation force us to do so.
Bill, one of the few times I saw you nodding in agreement with this gentleman since you've been sitting here at the panel has been when he mentioned the SWIFT issue in terms of targeting people on the basis of finding out where the money is and where it's coming from. No, it's difficult. However, this administration, the first move towards China in terms of, or towards Russia in the current conflict was to go after targeted individuals in terms of the money trail.
I give Stuart Levy invented this in the last administration, and I give him and then David Cohen, who succeeded him, and they both survived into this administration. I give them a lot of credit, but you have to keep in mind this was an extraordinary amount of effort. I mean, Stuart and David went around to virtually every bank in Europe and a good many in Asia, and basically strong-armed them into compliance. This was not just the United States saying, we're going to do this. It was going around and, talking bank by bank by bank and saying, we don't want you to do this, and implying that I think that there would be consequences if they didn't pay any attention. And the banks, literally one by one, fell into line. And, it was an extraordinary effort and one that produced some results. At the same time, it was really labor intensive. I mean, that's just basically what they did for a number of years. It shows you how difficult it is and how much hard work you have to do if you want to make these things stick. We can't just issue a pronouncement and the rest of the world is going to say, oh, okay, we'll stop dealing with the Russians. It doesn't work that way. This is the backfill problem that drives my companies crazy. It's not in China's interest to cooperate. And Russia is a good example for a number of reasons. There are sort of geopolitical reasons that we can talk about, but the other reason is to the extent that our guys get out, their guys get in. And particularly in Russia, they have some advantages anyway, some geographic and commercial advantages, and we hand them market share. Now, the argument of the proponents is essentially, well, it's worth it, and that's an argument. That's sort of a value argument. You have to make that decision for yourself. But I guess what sometimes frustrates us is what really frustrates us is dealing with the people who don't want to admit that the cost is there. I mean, you're not in that category. You've acknowledged the cost, and then what the president or Congress gets to do is decide and balance and do the analysis. What we try to do is point out, yeah, there are costs, and what we want you to do is weigh them. If at the end of the day you decide that the gain outweighs the cost, well then, the companies will suck it up and comply. There's any question about that. And for the record, we're against corruption too. I just want everyone to.
This is very reassuring to us.
I knew you were worried. I know you were.
You're a
you were
free
worried.
enterpriser, big time. So the fact that someone in free enterprise against corruption is refreshing for this audience, certainly.
For the record, I'm in favor of free enterprise too.
So I think what we'll do right now is we'll open this up for audience questions.
I worked a lot on South Africa in the 1980s, and I just have a few comments about the sanctions. All of you have discussed them. For years, the sanctions did not work. And what turned the tide as far as sanctions were concerned in South Africa was when Barclays Bank suddenly stopped lending in South Africa. That had an impact. So my question is, are we understanding at this point that financial sanctions are more effective than any other kind of sanctions?
The recent record suggests that, yeah. And as I said, they have some advantages because they're more particularized. They have the drawback that I also described, though, is that for banks, there's a tendency when they're under pressure on something like this to take the safe road and do what happened in that example and simply say, we're going to stop doing business in the country. And what that does is cut off humanitarian activity and legitimate licensed activity and food and medicine in this case, which is probably not good from any perspective, but the banks would rather be safe than get themselves into a compliance problem. I think that's what we're learning, that's the difficulty with it. And there's also the intelligence issue of making sure the people that you've identified are, if you decide to be particular, are actually the right people.
I think visa sanctions are useful, particularly if you take the case of Russia, where a lot of not just rich Russians, but middle-class Russians do like to travel to the West. Now, you're not going to necessarily deny middle-class Russians who have nothing to do with Ukraine or the Magnitsky case or any other gross human rights abuses the ability to travel west. I would say, though, for officials involved in any of that, you deny not just them, but you deny their families. You want to apply pressure on the officials to try to change their policy. And the best way to do that is to take, I would argue, a fairly wide net in doing so. And I know some will say that's guilt by association, of guilt by family, but we wouldn't be doing this if the government didn't engage in the kind of behavior that it is. You have to remember, as you know, sanctions are a reaction to something. As I said before about Russia, I wish we had taken steps that were more preemptive and preventive because I did fear that Russia would keep moving. But instead, the sanctions have been completely reactive on Russia. So I do think visa sanctions are important. Sanctions on sporting events, I do agree on the World Cup thing with South Africa, but the Olympics and with the Soviet Union in 1980 were a bomb. And so that didn't work. So I do think the more targeted kinds of financial sanctions, but also visa sanctions, are a better way to go.
I think we're leaving out a really important actor in today's foreign policy world, and that being non-state actors. Tonight's discussion really has been about states, right? But we have groups like ISIS. We have a number of examples of what are essentially failed states where you have non-state groups who have stepped in to fill that void and are essentially controlling whatever a state is doing. So I think that I wanted to just follow up with both David and Bill to see if any of your points about success, about the tailoring of sanctions change if what we're looking at are trying to impact the behavior of a non-state actor.
Well, it's, as you point out, it's a newer problem, not brand new, but I think it's probably one, if you want to do something in the sanctions area that's effective, and I think I would probably be inclined to argue that it's the chances of effective sanctions in the case of ISIS are very low. But if you want to go down that road, this gets back to, I mean, follow the money. It's always follow the money. They have to, you know, if you're going to control territory, you have to be able to sustain yourself. You have to feed your fighters. You have to take care of their families. And, you know, it's in their interest to demonstrate that they can govern the territory they've taken over. That demands resources. There's been some research done about how they do that. And I think the way to approach people in that context is, you know, figure out where the money's coming from and then figure out how to stop it.
I think that's right. I mean, I think you go after the countries, governments, people, organizations that are supporting this activity. It's hard, if not impossible, to sanction ISIS. What do you go after? But it's like an activity there. I was just looking at this list. You know, we have counter-narcotics, trafficking sanctions, counter-terrorism, non-proliferation, diamond trade controls, transnational criminal organizations. These are activities, and there's also a list of governments that we've imposed sanctions on. I mean, ISIS engages in terrorism, and that's what we're sanctioning, is acts of terrorism. And so I think we do have to keep in mind that we have imposed sanctions for specific kinds of activity that are deemed unacceptable or, again, terrorism. But it's a much harder thing to do. You know, you target a government, you know where to find it. You target ISIS, it's a lot harder to find. It's a much more amorphous thing to go after.
So I want to thank our two distinguished panelists tonight. Both Bill and David, I think, have lived our ethos. They've shared their knowledge. We are enriched by it, and we are thankful for your presence tonight. Thank you so much.
Thanks. Pleasure.
Thank you for joining us for World Affairs Today, a production of the World Affairs Council, Washington, D.C. Stay connected with us at www.worldaffairstoday.org.